back to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the Roman Empire. So, let's talk about Nero and his reign. So, Nero, of course, was the fourth member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the final Julio-Claudian emperor. And of course, we started with Tiberius being the first, and then Gaius or Caligula was the second, and then Claudius was the third, and now Nero. And so here's a statue of Nero, and we'll talk about his beard in a minute. We'll also talk a little bit about his relationship with his mother, which was quite interesting. This is, of course, Agrippina the Younger here, Caligula's sister, and of course here is Nero when he was a bit younger, as an early teenager, late teenager, early 20s years old during this period in this statue. And so when he takes over, he's relatively young, and he was supposed to co-rule with Britannicus. However, Agrippina the Younger arranged for Britannicus to be murdered by poison, and actually probably prepared the poison herself, since she was quite apt at that, and so knocked off young Britannicus, and so no longer does Nero have to co-rule as emperor from the year 54 onwards to the year 68, when he would end up being, well, die. We'll talk about that in a bit, but he rules from 54 to 68, and he lived from the year 37 to 68, obviously. And so when he is young, she is going to exceed her influence over him quite a bit, and use her influence not only just as being his mother, but also by being a sexual partner of Nero. She was actually having an affair with her son, in a very weird way, right? And so, bit of a kind of taboo thing, definitely, at the very least. But she was using that influence over him to basically be really calling the shots in the empire, when it was supposed to be him. Well, obviously, he wanted rid of her after a few years of this, and realizing that, just telling her, no, I'm an adult now, I can rule on my own, wasn't cutting it. And so he decided that he was going to have to kill her. He first arranged to try to kill her through multiple attempts at poisoning. Multiple attempts. Of course, she either knew what she was being given and was taking the antidote, or knew what to look for in poison and had taste testers or something do it for and take the food beforehand. Either way, the poisoning did not work, probably also because she was kind of an expert at poison herself. Eventually, he comes up with a new method to kill her, and that is by telling her that she won a cruise. As in, like, a cruise like we would go on a cruise ship. Well, he says that she won a cruise because the people of Rome, or the Italian people, and the people of the empire, loved her, and loved her being Caligula's sister, and loved her since, and understood that that was quite an ordeal then, and also that she was the empress with Claudius, and now that she has been taking such good care of Nero and raising him to be a great emperor, that they want to reward her somehow. This is all what, of course, Nero tells her. Well, Nero has actually arranged this entire thing himself, and he has specifically ordered his engineers to build this boat for Agrippina to ride around on one of the lakes in the middle of Italy, okay? And these lakes are very, very large, massive lakes, like multiple miles long, wide, etc., like Lake Pontchartrain, but much bigger than that in some cases. And so, one of those lakes is what she's going to be taking this cruise on. Well, this ship, while she is sleeping on it, okay, one night of sailing around this lake, is actually rigged with a false bottom. That the bottom would open up and that water would flow into it, and basically the cruise ship would sink with her and anyone else on it on board. And hopefully they wouldn't know how to swim, and they would probably drown, right? Or if she was sleeping, that she would drown in the ship without, ever waking up. However, this does not work, because whatever ends up happening, the crew jumping off overboard or whatever, ends up waking her up, because she is actually able to somewhat swim, and swims actually to the shore. However, Nero had already kind of planned for what if the ship didn't actually kill her, and she didn't drown, by sending 3 assassins to the shore of this lake, to watch the ship go down to make sure that she was dead, and to identify the body if she washed up on shore afterwards, if she actually did drown. Well, the three assassins are actually standing on the side of the shore as they see the ship sink, which it was planned to do, right? And so she is actually able to jump off the ship and swim to shore. Well, they see a woman swimming towards them, and they run out into the beach, and they actually stab this woman multiple times and kill her. However, the woman that they saw was actually one of her maids and one of her assistants. And so she, however, Agrippina the Younger, was actually only a few yards away when she sees this and kind of like stops swimming loudly and screaming for help and sees, the assistant killed, her maid killed, and so actually kind of swims further down along the lake of the shore and eventually makes her way back to Rome. And so, of course, Nero's entire plan of even having 3 assassins kill her as well as the crews did not work. Eventually, he pays either the same 3 assassins or 3 more, and actually they eventually go and stab her. One day in the middle of Rome, or on her way back to Rome. And so, eventually he is able to off his mother. But it took a bit of doing. She probably had like 9 lives, or something like that. Continuing on, he also did marry several times. Multiple women in marriages, as well as married 2 men, 2 different men, including one of them that he decided to castrate. Removing their genitalia. And so, quite interesting marriages. Nero was quite crazy when it came to being in the courtroom, in the royal court, or the imperial court, not courtroom, sorry, and had many advisors, and the turnover rate of his advisors was quite high. They kept on having to get new advisors for him, because many of them decided to commit suicide rather than actually have to deal with him. That's how bad he was, because he usually just didn't listen to them and also killed a few, and many of them decided, okay, well, I'm just going to commit suicide rather than be tortured or something by him if I upset him, which was usually the case. And so he must have been absolutely a nightmare to deal with work-wise. Many of them actually killed themselves. He also had a very lavish lifestyle. He wrote very, very bad poetry. I don't believe any of it exists today, but several of the Roman historians of the period tell us about it, and yeah, it's awful, even from their point of view. However, everyone that heard the poetry in Nero's presence said it was wonderful. Why? Because he probably would have had them killed otherwise. He also played the lyre, okay, which this is actually a picture of the Nero's actual lyre, in one of the museums in Rome, I believe it is, today. Not the fiddle, okay? A lot of people said he used to play the fiddle, which is kind of like a guitar-looking thing. Let's go to a picture of it. This is kind of what a fiddle looks like, a very large one. That is actually incorrect. A fiddle is also kind of a small little violin or guitar. Okay, you've maybe seen them before, but he did not play the fiddle. A lot of people say that he did. It was actually the lyre that he played, because the fiddle wasn't even invented yet. But this is actually his lyre, his actual one. He also grew a beard in Greek fashion. This is a sculpture of him with a beard. Romans did not have beards. That was something that the Romans did not do. They usually were very clean-shaven all the time. It was just a grooming habit of theirs and a culture thing. However, beards were very Greek, and worn and held by many Greek men. And Nero was obviously educated by Greek tutors, as was common in Rome for the patrician class, and so he was obviously tutored by Greeks, as well as fell in love with everything Greek possible, including the Olympics, the Olympic Games. He even held the Olympic Games in Italy a couple times, or went to Rome for them, or went to Greece for them himself. He had other games held in Rome, sorry. But when he actually held these Olympic Games, he would actually participate in them, in every single event he could. From running, to throwing different objects, to jumping and things like that. And, of course, in the races, every single time he won. And every single time he threw something, it was somehow further than everybody else threw. Because they would purposely not throw as far as they could. They would purposely not run as fast as they could. Because they wanted him to win, because they knew that if they didn't let him win, he'd probably kill them. And so, just like the poetry, wasn't very good at it, but everyone made it out to be that he was. Continuing on, eventually he wanted to enlarge the imperial palace. And he tried to actually pass a law with the Senate to allow him to expand the imperial palace to further down the hills from the hill that it was on, as well as take up parts of the different parts of the city, and the Senate kind of said no. Well, we are not exactly sure if he set the fire in Rome, but we do know that sometime in Rome, during his reign, there was a massive, massive fire, where the palace itself, most of it burned down, as well as 9 of the 13 wards of Rome. Okay, there was 13 to 14 districts, or city territory districts of the city of Rome. 9 of them burned down completely during this palace fire. And we are not exactly sure who actually set this fire. Many Roman historians said that, while they're not positive that Nero did it, and that Nero was actually miles away at his villa outside the city of Rome, that possibly the Praetorian Guard that were left in the city of Rome did cause the fire, because they were seen by reportedly members of the public and people in the city of Rome running around the city with torches during the fire. Now, of course, if they're running around with torches at night, that can make sense, right? They could actually be running around with their torches because they were trying to see in the dark in the city streets, because there weren't city lights and things like that. They didn't have flashlights. They had to have fire torches. But they could have also been burning things with those torches. We don't know, right? We do know, however, that Nero was not in the city when the city caught fire. He was actually multiple miles away at his own little private villa or private townhouse base or countryside house. And the joke is that he played the lyre or the fiddle, as many people used to say, the fiddle while it burned. Did he do that? Well, this picture seems to indicate that he was able to see the city from far away burning, and he was here playing his big giant fiddle, which a fiddle isn't even that big. And more importantly, the fiddle wasn't invented, as I said last slide, that it was actually the lyre. But again, he probably wasn't even able to see the fire from where he was. He was literally miles away, maybe see like smoke rising at night, but unlikely. Did he probably set the fire? He himself, definitely not. The Praetorian Guard, maybe. Maybe it was just an accident. We don't know. Historians even then couldn't exactly confirm he did it or not. But we do know that eventually, when Nero comes home, within a couple days of the fire burning half the city down, or 9/13 of the city down, rather, we end up having him blame it immediately on the Christians. Because the Christians at this time were a up-and-coming new religion. At this time in Rome, they've been around for multiple years, of course, about 50 or so years after, or no, not 50 years, about 20 or so years, because of Jesus' death in 35. And of course, this was around 50 to 60 CE when this happened. And so, the Christianity is actually beginning to spread. However, Nero is one of the few emperors that actually persecuted the Christians, okay? Many people think, and incorrectly think, that the Christians were constantly attacked by the Romans. That is not true. Many of the Romans didn't care that there were Christians. Many of the Roman emperors did not care about the Christians and had no rules one way or another for or against Christianity. However, Nero is one of the 3 or so emperors that really, really did do something against the Christians, and what he did at first was blame the fire on them. And it was a convenient scapegoat, really was what it was that he realized that someone needs to be blamed for the fire. Maybe he set it, and maybe that's why he blamed the Christians. Maybe he didn't know who set it, and just wanted to blame the Christians to get rid of them because he thought they were different. And that was the issue, was the Christians were slightly different. As opposed to worshipping the pantheon of Roman gods, they worshipped only one god, which was a bit weird back then. And so, during Nero's reign, the disciples, Peter and Paul, the 12 disciples from Peter and Paul as in Jesus' 12 disciples. Peter was actually tortured and crucified upside down by Nero. Okay, he said that he could not. Peter said himself that he was not worthy of being crucified correctly, that he had to be crucified upside down, and so they laid the cross upside down when they crucified him. And Paul we're not exactly sure what happened to the disciple Paul. We believe he was beheaded, but we're not positive. Many other Christians were also blamed for the fire of the city of Rome, as well as other issues at the time by Nero, and just regularly persecuted by Nero because he didn't like them. And the common punishment for Christianity in Rome during Nero's reign only was actually tying them up to a pole, a metal or wooden post in the middle of Rome, okay, like along the streets, covering them in tar and oil and lighting fire to them at night so they could basically be lampposts. And so, yeah, kind of crazy, but that was Nero's way to get rid of and blame the Christians for the city of Rome's fire, whether it might have actually been him. He also raised taxes heavily to pay for the rebuilding of the city of Rome as well as his palace, which he took precedence in rebuilding his palace. And of course, this upset many, many, many people in the provinces, as well as the governors. In fact, this tax raising led to a rebellion in multiple provinces throughout the empire, as well as eventually a civil war that started at the end of the year 68 CE, when the Roman governor Galba, the governor of Spain, and multiple other governors decided to start rebelling against Nero and actually start clustering up armies from their provinces, okay, from the legions, and start marching towards Rome, ready to take over from Nero by force. Nero finds out about Galba doing this from Spain and tries to commit suicide. While he tries to commit suicide, he realizes he really doesn't have the stomach to actually do it himself, so he ends up actually having a slave kill him for him. And so the beginning of the Civil War is Galba, right here, being governor of Spain, rising up. We will have another one in Gaul and Britain named Vitellius that will do the same. We've got another one, Vespasianus, in these areas over here. And then we've got another one from Spain, Otho, here. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about that civil war in a bit. But first, let's talk a little bit about issues going over right over here in the Jerusalem, Syria area, which is very pertinent to the lecture at this time because it's going to have to do with this man, Vespasianus. Well, eventually. And so, again, we're going to be covering this period area here of Syria and Judea, which is, of course, this area if you enlarge the map. Okay? And so, eventually, there was a king named Herod the Great. Okay? King Herod the Great. He ruled Jerusalem from the year 37 BCE to the year 4 CE. So we're a little bit back in time from the year that Nero is in charge and killing himself. Okay? He was a tyrant and very hated by the people of Syria and Palestine and Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, but he was hated by all of them. He also killed possible successors, meaning family members, members that were possibly generals and things like that, and other politicians that were under him in Jerusalem. But he was able to do so because he was really a puppet king put in power by Rome. Rome had kind of backed him, and Rome had kind of sent an army to basically make Herod the Great the client kingdom ruler of Judea, okay, of Judea, which was basically this whole area at the time, okay, before it was a Roman province. Eventually, King Herod the Great would die in 4 CE. He would die of, I think, natural causes by the seams of it. There's no direct manner of death, but at that point, Rome decided, okay, well, instead of appointing another person in charge of Judea as a client kingdom continuing it, let's just take it over and keep our army here and just put a governor in charge. And so that's exactly what they did. So Rome took over fully when Herod the Great died. Eventually, the Romans ruling over the Judeans was okay. At first, it was fine. Everything was peachy. The people of Judea, Jerusalem, were fine with the Romans ruling over them, because it was kind of the same as Herod the Great ruling over them, and while if he wasn't around to kill people, they were like, okay, well, that's fine. The Romans won't kill some of us now, because Herod's gone. And so things were fine, because the Romans actually respected the Judean laws and customs. But eventually, religious differences between the Jewish people and tax disputes began to develop. And that kind of started with Pontius Pilate being called in to be governor over there, as well as beforehand, as well as just afterwards, okay? During that whole period of time, around the 30s CE, as well as beforehand. So around 4 CE onwards, it was okay, and then after a little while, it started going problems within 20 years, 20 to 30 years. Eventually, the poor economy in Judea and Syria, okay, and lack of good leadership that was liked by the Jewish people really led to major problems, and people of Judea and Jerusalem actually began to riot. And this becomes known as eventually small riots, and eventually leads to a larger war, where it is known as the First Jewish War between the Jews and the Romans in this, of course, area here. Which breaks out in the year 66 CE, and it lasts until the year 73 CE, and it is also known as the Great Revolt. It is known as the Great Revolt because the people of Judea or Jerusalem call it the Great Revolt. That's what they call it, because they are revolting against the Roman laws, okay, and the Roman leadership, okay? And so as we move on, let's talk a little bit quickly about this First Jewish War or the Great Revolt. Again, same area. Eventually, the governor and legion commander in the area is a man named Vespasian. And he has his young son, who was around his 20s at the time, Titus, with him as his second in command. He was basically grooming young Titus to become eventually a legion commander himself. And so Vespasian and Titus were ruling in Syria as governor and legion commanders, and the revolt starts in 66 CE, 2 years before the revolt with Nero happens, okay, so we're caught up, okay, right? And so they actually start fighting against the Jewish people in this First Jewish-Roman War. And it works. Eventually, Rome invades the city of Galilee in 67 CE and takes it over. And then, 2 years later, Vespasian hears of all the problems in Rome, and that multiple governors from other parts of the Roman Empire have marched to Rome declaring themselves as emperors. And so Vespasian himself decides in the year 69 CE to go to Rome with multiple of his legions himself. And so he takes 1 or 2 of his legions from Syria and marches towards Rome, leaving his young son Titus in charge of Syria, okay, with the remaining legion or 2 here. Jewish refugees actually flee to Jerusalem itself. They've been basically cut off from everywhere else in the province and have to flee to the city itself. Titus himself leads his soldiers to attack the city of Jerusalem, and after 7 long months of siege and constant fighting for the city, where many inhabitants of the people of the city, the inhabitants meaning the people of the city, actually starved to death during the 7 months because there is literally no food in the city by the end of the 7 months. Titus captures the city successfully for Rome, ending, or almost ending, the Jewish-Roman War. There's a little bit of fighting for the next 3 years, but very small. The Romans, under Titus, immediately after taking over the city of Jerusalem, immediately burn the entire city down, okay, as well as destroying the temple, which was very sacred to the Jewish people and upset a lot of them. Titus immediately then decides to just go to Rome to join his father, thinking that everything is done. Well, the thing is, it's not actually done. For the next 3 years, there's going to be this continuing Jewish-Roman war, but in a lesser degree, until eventually it's going to be a much larger issue, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit first about the Year of the 4 Emperors, which is the year of 68 to 69 CE. And so, the Year of the 4 Emperors begins when, of course, multiple emperor governors start declaring themselves as emperor. And so let's talk about that. And of course, we've got a picture of each of them. We've got a picture of Galba. He never had a bust made. He had a sculpture made or a coin made for him. He was the first one to declare himself in Spain as emperor. We have another one, Otho, in Spain. We'll get to him in a minute. Vitellius for Gaul or France, and then Vespasian, the East, meaning Syria. And so let's talk a little bit about each of them in order. So Galba finds out that Nero is absolutely terrible and decides that he is going to invade the city of Rome himself. And in Spain, where he is governor, he decides, along with his army in Spain, decides to announce himself as emperor because he wants to revolt and kick Nero off the throne. And so he gets an army together in Spain and marches from Spain, this brown portion of Spain, to the city of Rome. When he gets to Rome, he finds out that Nero has already killed himself. Well, the slave killed him. And so he pronounces himself as emperor and has a coin made for him and is emperor for a total of 7 months. However, this guy, Otho, the governor of the other half of Spain, this blue half of Spain, actually gets an army together himself and marches into Rome with that army after the 7 months of Galba ruling, and gets to Rome, and soldiers fight between Galba's soldiers and Otho's soldiers, fighting against each other in the civil war, and eventually some of Otho's soldiers find Galba in the palace, in the Roman palace, and actually cut his head off and throw him in the pool. Okay, they actually throw his body in the pool, in one of the pools, in one of the fountains. Meaning that Otho is now in charge, because Otho was the one that just overthrew Galba, or Otho's soldiers did. Otho's soldiers immediately announced that Otho is now the new emperor of Rome. That Galba ruled for 7 months, but now Otho gets to rule. Well, Otho's rule is very short. It's only 95 days, so about 3 months. And he kills himself when he finds out that Vitellius, this guy from Gaul, meaning France, right? Gaul, right? Gaul and Britannia, but Gaul mostly, starts marching with an army also to the city of Rome. And so, when Otho finds out that Vitellius' army is about to capture him and has defeated his own army, he decides to commit suicide with his own sword and kills himself. And immediately after that, of course, Vitellius, this new emperor, is now proclaimed as the emperor. And he lasts for a total of 8 months, until eventually Vespasian, over in Syria and Jerusalem, decides to march with his own army. And eventually he gets there after Vitellius has been in charge for 8 months, and eventually poor Vitellius decides to hide behind several curtains or in a cupboard in the palace of Rome, and eventually Vespasian's soldiers find him and kill him, and his body is then not just tossed, into a grave, but actually tossed into the Tiber River itself, and it floats all the way down the Tiber River or sinks. We're not exactly sure. But Vitellius is obviously killed by Vespasian's men, and his body is disposed of in the Tiber River. And, of course, Vespasian is proclaimed emperor by his own soldiers, and he actually lasts for 10 years. And so the year of the 4 emperors, the year of 68 to 69 CE, about a year and a bit, but it's about a year and a half, is when these 3 ruled, is over. It was the year of the 4 emperors. 4 different emperors were in charge during that one, basically 12-month period, or 15-month period. And so, or a little bit more than 15 months. And so it's kind of interesting that we had this 1 year with multiple emperors. Well, let's cut to what happens under Vespasian's rule in the next video.